Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be giving book recommendations for accessible classic literature, so if you aren't used to reading classics and you're intimidated by classic literature and you don't know where to start, this video is for you. I'm going to try to not ramble as much as I usually do in my videos, so let's just go ahead and get started with the recommendations. So the first book I'm going to recommend today is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This book gets thrown around all the time on accessible classic literature videos and lists and stuff because it is really accessible. Even though it's an old book, it's very immersive and I found myself reading it very fast. I read the whole thing basically in one afternoon when I read it, and I was pretty much completely entrenched in the story. It is a kind of like the classic deal with the devil sort of story where the main character, Dorian Gray, sells his soul for eternal youth, and in return he has a portrait of him, but he becomes corrupted by various immoral things that he gets into, and as he does bad things, the portrait of him begins to get uglier and uglier. So it's kind of like inner beauty, outer beauty. And the other thing about Oscar Wilde that in this book in particular is that, so Oscar Wilde was gay, and in this time, Victorian England, that's not a socially acceptable thing. But he managed to put in some rather homoerotic moments into The Picture of Dorian Gray, and for that reason, this book was actually banned a lot of times. It's like one of those books that was banned a lot. It's a very good book, and I would highly recommend it, and it's very quick and very fun to read, so I definitely recommend it. The second book I'm going to talk about is The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. So I don't usually put like trigger warnings, but this book probably deserves a trigger warning. It is about depression, okay? And it's about, there's a lot of, if you don't, well, I mean, it's not really a spoiler, but like, there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of depiction of suicide in this book, so if that is going to bother you, just a heads up. The Bell Jar is one of my favorite books of all time. The main character is very relatable to me, which, don't worry, but I find that the main character of The Bell Jar, Esther Greenwood, is kind of like almost universally relatable to women. I don't want to say that because like I don't speak for all women in the world, but there's a lot of things that I could relate to that I think lots of other women can relate to. Though it's kind of like it's one of those like stream of consciousness sort of narratives where it just goes into the main character's life and her very troubled emotions, and so if you've struggled with mental health, this book is relatable. And there's this one passage in the book which always will stick with me where it's like pretty well known as the fig tree passage, and it's basically like about the paradox of choices when you have so many choices of what to do with your life that it seems impossible to choose. If you've ever felt lonely, if you've ever felt sad, if you've ever felt lost, or like your life is meaningless, or like everything is monotonous, or you are paralyzed by choices and you have no idea what you want to do with your life because there are so many things to do, this book will resonate with you a lot. If you've ever felt trapped by society's expectations for women, and trapped by the idea that you need to get married and have kids and all this other stuff, this book will be related to you, and it's a very good book, so I would definitely recommend this. Alright, so the third book I'm going to talk about is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, and I love this book. Rebecca is about this woman who gets swept up in a whirlwind romance on her vacation, and she ends up moving to this guy's big giant mansion and getting married to him right away. And so when she moves into his giant estate, which is called Manderley, she starts settling into her life there, and it becomes apparent that something is off, something is going on here that's very unsettling, because so the man that she married, his old wife is dead, and her name is Rebecca. And so the main character, who is never named, by the way, she never gets a name in the book, so the whole time she's thinking about how does she measure up to Rebecca? Are people comparing her to Rebecca? What is, like, Rebecca seems to have like a huge presence, and she starts noticing that something is very wrong here in this house. Like, something is going on with her husband, and it's very creepy. It's like a very good psychological thriller sort of thing. The writing is incredibly immersive. You will feel completely immersed into the story. And it gives you this like very palpable vibe of uncertainty and foreboding throughout the novel, and I would definitely recommend this book. Next, in the spirit of Christmas, which is coming up very soon, as I post this video, is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. So this one's a good place to start with Charles Dickens because everybody knows the story. Christmas goes to Christmas past, present, future, blah blah blah. So you'll know what's going on, and it's short as well. And the thing about this book, when I read it, I was surprised at all the humor that there was in it. Because my perception of Charles Dickens was like, oh, like old, thick, boring books, right? I feel like that's a common perception, but he's actually a very funny writer. And there's a lot of humor in A Christmas Carol that like doesn't really get conveyed in a lot of modern adaptations of it, I feel like. Well, I can't really say that because I'm only judging based off like the Mickey Mouse one. But anyways, next we have The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy. And if you're like me, when you think of Leo Tolstoy, you probably think of War and Peace, like giant doorstoppers, Russian literature. And that's what I think of too, but this book is actually quite short. So, yeah, so it's about this guy named Ivan Ilyich, as the title would suggest, who finds out that he is dying. And the entire story is about him coming to terms with the fact that he is sick and that he is going to die soon. And it's like, it's coming to terms with death. As we all know that death is a great subject to read about, my favorite type of book to read is books about the inevitable death of us all. I read this book in, I think, one sitting. Maybe it was one sitting. I don't know. I rarely read books in like one exact sitting, but I read it pretty quickly. And I remember just thinking about how a lot of the stuff about mortality and the struggle of coming to terms with your own mortality is something that I relate to, as that's something I've struggled with quite a bit. As someone who thinks about death too much, this book kind of like voiced some of the thoughts that I have and made me think about the deep truths of existence. And speaking of books that make you think of the deep truths of existence, the next book I'm going to talk about is The Stranger by Albert Camus. And I've reviewed this on my YouTube channel in the past. That was my first video because it's one of my favorite books, and so I had to rep one of my favorite books in my first video. So this, literally, I have seemingly adopted Albert Camus as one of my personality traits at this point, because The Stranger basically is about this guy who he ends up committing a murder randomly, and then it's basically about life and existence and whether there's a meaning to existence and how to cope with that. And I can't really explain that much. It's kind of a book you have to read. I can't really give a good synopsis of it without you actually reading it, so read it. Just go ahead and read it. The next book I want to talk about is 1984 by George Orwell. Of course I have to include 1984 in this list. This was one of my favorite classics for a very long time, and still is, though I haven't read it for a while, so I probably should reread it before I keep on being like, oh yeah, I love this book. I read this book like 3 years ago at this point, and I remember I really liked it because of the way that it basically revolutionized the way that I think about politics and rhetoric, which that's because of the entire like thought police newspeak stuff. And 1984 has like a huge impact on like popular culture. So it's the quintessential dystopian book. Follows an extreme totalitarian government and a lone dissenter who tries to escape the hold that the society has on him. And it's very good. I don't want to spoil anything, but it's very good, except for the second part, which is basically just like a long sex scene and a textbook. But still read it. Still read the whole book, okay? Just read 1984, please. And then finally, the very last book I'm going to recommend is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. This is one of the quintessential American literature, whatever, books, and it's controversial for a couple different reasons. A lot of people are like, oh, it's a white savior narrative, but I highly disagree with the idea that Atticus Finch playing a prominent role means that makes the book racist. I think it's quite an anti-racist book. I'm going on a sidetrack here, but the entire story is about, it's told from it's like follows the perspective of Scout, a young girl, and her brother Jem, and their gradual realization of the ingrained racism and injustice in their small southern town when a black man is falsely accused of rape. And it's like basically like a coming of age story where they lose the childhood innocence of thinking that the world is just, and they realize that the town is really freaking racist. I think it's a very good book, and I imagine that it would have been good social commentary when it was published. So those are all the beginner-friendly classic books I'm going to recommend today. If you like this video, please subscribe and leave a like. This channel is brand new, so I could really use the help, and stick around for the next video, I guess.